Today's lesson will be Chapter 23, Problem 2B. You should be able to see Chapter 23, Problem 2B on my Excel screen. What we're going to be looking at is variance analysis, and we're going to be doing this for flexible budgeting. We're going to be the company I'm Really Cold Coat Company, and we're going to make women's and men's coats. So this time, what's different from what we have done in the last video is that we have two products that we're making. Women's coats and men's coats are going to be the products that we're going to be making. Both of those coats are going to require two materials, filler and lining. So again, we're going to be working with two types of materials, which is a little bit different than they did with the first problem that we did as a recording. And then they had the following planning information that had been made available. So they started out by giving you their standard amounts per unit. You'll remember the standard amount is what we should have completed as far as our goals were concerned. The standard amount is the budget that we set up. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at what actually happened to this company, and we're going to compare the standard amount with the actual amounts. So the standard amounts are the budgeted amounts, and they've given you the filler, which is measured in pounds. For women's coat, it would take 4 pounds to produce one woman's coat. To produce men's coat, it takes 5.2 pounds of filler. And then they've given you the standard price of the materials, which is $2 for the filler. And they've given you the standard price for the liner, which is $8. They've also told you that the liner is going to be measured in yards, and it takes 7 yards to produce one woman's coat, 9.4 yards to produce one man's coat. We also have budgeted our planned production is going to be 5,000 planned units for women's coats, 6,200 for men's coats. They've also given us a standard direct labor rate per hour for the women's coat. The budgeted amount, the standard amount is $14. For the men's coat, it's $13. Then they've given you some additional information that tells about the actual results of what happened during this period of time. So they actually produced 4,400 women's coats and 5,800 men's coats. And the filler was $1.90 was the actual price for the filler per pound. The actual quantity that they bought and they used was 48,000 pounds of filler. For the liner, the actual price of the liner per yard is $8.20. The actual amount of liner purchased and used was 85,100 yards. The actual labor rate for women's coats was $14.10, and for men's coats, it was $13.30. The actual labor time it took to produce those coats were 1,825 for the women's coats and 2,800 for the men's coats. The expected amount of beginning inventory and desired inventory are going to be realized. So what they want you to do is to prepare the following variances for both types of coats, both the women's coats and the men's coats. The first variance that they want you to calculate is the price variance. This is the price variance, and this is the formula for the price variance. Notice this time I chose to put the formula straight down so you can see each step individually. Now, because we have two types of direct materials, we have filler and we have liner, I'm going to do my filler separate from my liner, and then I'm going to combine it together to get the total direct materials price variance. So this is basically the same thing that you did in the last video. The only difference is we have two types of materials that we have to account for. In this case, we're going to start with our filler. Notice they want you to write down the actual price of the filler. The actual price of the filler is $1.90. That was given in the problem. So the actual price of the filler is $1.90 per pound. We're going to compare that with the standard price. And the standard price was given to you of the filler is $2. And then what we have to do is look at the actual price and compare it to the budgeted price. Our actual price was less than our budgeted amount by 10 cents, so we know that this is going to be a favorable variance. You need to multiply that by the actual quantity of filler that you used. And the actual quantity of filler that we used was 48,000. So notice how I plugged that 48,000 in there. Then you simply multiply 48,000 times 10 cents, which will give you a direct materials price variance of $4,800 for the filler. And it is favorable because the actual price was less than the budgeted amount. So this is the amount for the filler. For the liner, we're going to take this same formula and use it for the liner. We're going to start with our actual price, which was given. The actual price of the liner is $8.20. We're going to compare this with the standard price of the liner, and the standard price of the liner is $8. So my actual price was $8.20. My standard price was $8. This time my actual is more than my standard, so we have an unfavorable 20-cent variance. That 20 cent has to be multiplied by the actual quantity. And the actual quantity used of the liner was 85,100. We just plugged that in. So 85,100 times 20 cents will give you $17,020, which is unfavorable. Since we have two types of materials, we're going to combine both variances together to get a total direct materials price variance of 12,220. So these two are combined together because my unfavorable amount was larger than my favorable amount. I still have an unfavorable balance for the direct materials price variance. The next thing that they require you to do is your direct materials quantity variance. And the quantity variance formula is right here. The actual quantity less the standard quantity gives you the variance, times the standard price gives you the direct materials quantity variance. Your actual quantity was given to you. It's 48,000 for the filler. So the actual quantity of the filler that we used was 48,000 pounds of filler. So that's where I'm getting this amount right here. It is a given amount. Now on the standard quantity, they did not give you the standard quantity. So what you had to do, or what you'll need to do, is make up a supporting calculation to show how you get the standard quantity. And this supporting calculations is right down here where I've listed it for we'll start with the filler first. And what we need to do is we need to take the standard number of pounds it's going to take to produce 1 unit of women's coats. Women's coats takes 4 pounds of filler, and you're going to get that from the filler women's coats, 4 pounds. Now the amount of I'm sorry, I got off on the wrong no, I didn't. I was talking about the standard qualifications. I'm sorry. Let me get myself straight here. We were talking about how to calculate the standard quantity of filler, because you need to show that in the supporting calculation. So we started with the woman's coats. We went to our information and we picked up that it would take 4 pounds to produce 1 coat, 1 woman's coat, 1 women's coat. Easy for me to say. All right. You're going to multiply that by the actual units produced. And this amount was given to you in cell address B19. So if you go up to the top here, you can see where I'm going to get that 4,400. This is the actual production of women's coats, was 4,400 coats that were actually produced. Then you're going to multiply the actual units produced times the budgeted amount of the number of pounds of filler that it was going to take to produce 1 woman's coat. So 4,400 times 4 gives you the standard quantity of filler that we need for the women's coats. For the men's coats, the filler is going to take 5.2 pounds, and we get that from cell address C8. So if you look back at C8, this is the filler, this is the men's coats. 5.2 pounds is the amount of the filler for the men's coats. The actual coats that were produced were 5,800 men's coats. So 5,800 men's coats times 5.2 pounds of filler gives you the total quantity of filler for the men's coats. Then you're going to take the amount of filler it took for the women's coats plus the amount of filler for the men's coats, and the total filler for the amount that is the standard quantity is 47,760 pounds. And that is going to be substituted in right here. And then you can move on with your direct materials quantity variance by comparing the actual to the standard. We used more materials than we budgeted for by 240 pounds. We're going to multiply that by the budgeted price for this filler, which is $2. And the budgeted price of $2 comes from right here. This is the standard price for the filler, or the budgeted amount of the cost for the filler is $2. So $2 times 240 pounds of filler gives you $480 as the direct materials quantity variance of the filler. You're going to do the same procedure for the liner, except you're going to use the liner information. The actual quantity of liner was 85,100 yards. That is given right here. So the standard quantity of the liner, we don't know, and we have to figure it based on the calculations below. So here's the calculations for the liner. We're going to start with our standard number of yards per unit, which for the women's coats is 7 yards of liner for each woman's coat that is produced. We're going to multiply that by the actual units produced of women's coats, and that was given. The actual units produced of women's coats is 4,400 units, or 4,400 coats. So we're going to multiply our actual units times our standard number of yards for our women's coats. How much liner it took for one woman's coat was 7 yards. 4,400 times 7 yards gives you a standard quantity of 30,800 yards for the women's coats. Now you're going to also have to figure it for the men's coats before we can find the total standard quantity for both the women's and men's coats. So starting with your men's coats now, we're going to take the standard number of yards per unit, and that's a given amount. So your standard amount of yards per unit for liner for women's coats is 7, but we're doing the one for men's. So we're going to look at the standard amount of liner for men's coats, 9.4 yards. So 9.4 yards is the standard number of yards of men's coats. Then we're going to multiply that by the actual men's coats that were produced during this period of time. The actual amount of men's coats were 5,800. Multiply 5,800 times 9.4, which is the standard number of yards to produce one man's coat. You multiply these, it will give you 54,520, which combined with the women's coats yardage gives you a total amount of liner that is the standard quantity of 85,320. So that's going to be substituted in for the quantity, the standard quantity amount of our liner, since that's what we were working on. So this and this is the same. Since our actual was less than our standard amount, we have a favorable variance. We have a negative amount, which is a favorable variance. Our actual quantity was less than what we budgeted for, so the amount is favorable. Anytime it's favorable, you have to put a minus sign in front of the favorable amount in Cengage. So that's just a little hint that will help you. Since this is 220 yards that are favorable for the liner, we're going to multiply that by the standard price, the budgeted price, which is $8. And that $8 was given to you right here. So $8 times 220 yards gives you a favorable variance of minus 1760. Then you're going to combine your favorable with your unfavorable variance. And since we had more favorable than unfavorable, we have left over a favorable balance here. And once we know what the direct materials quantity variance is, we can combine that with our direct materials price variance. And since there's an unfavorable higher amount than a favorable amount, that difference of $10,940 is unfavorable, because this one was unfavorable and this was favorable. The net of those is 10,940, which is your total direct materials cost variance. So they wanted the total amount of the variance, and that total amount is here. And then they wanted you to combine both of these together to get that this is still going to be an unfavorable amount. And I should have had that written in there. So you would know that when you combine both of these together, you still have more unfavorable variance than you did favorable. And so that's how you calculate the direct materials price variance and the direct materials quantity variance. Right here is another method where we could have come up with the total of the materials variance. It's not necessarily that you memorize all this stuff right here on this other method, but I just showed it to you because there is another way to arrive at some of the numbers that they're requesting you for, or requesting of you. So when you combine both of these together, it's still unfavorable. And I should have put unfavorable out here to the side so you know that. But notice how this amount here matches up with this amount up here. And so this is just another method of calculating your total materials cost variance. In the second part of this problem, or actually the second part of requirement number 1, they also want you to calculate the direct labor rate variance and the direct labor time variance, and eventually the total direct labor variance. So we're going to start with our direct labor rate variance. Again, I put the formula here for that. And all you do is plug in amounts for both women's and men's coats. And then you're going to combine the amounts together to get the total amount of the direct labor rate variance. So actual direct labor rate of $14.10 was given right here. The standard direct labor rate was also given. The standard direct labor rate for women's coats is 14. And then you compare your actual with your standard. The actual was more, so this becomes an unfavorable variance. And unfavorable variances, again, I should have written that in here so you would know that this variance here is unfavorable. It's unfavorable by 10 cents because the actual amount was more than the standard amount. Then we're going to take that 10 cents and multiply it by the actual hours, which was given. This 1,825 is given. So when you multiply the two of these, that gives you the direct labor rate variance for women's coats. For men's coats, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to take your actual direct labor rate. The actual direct labor rate for men's coats was $13.30. We're going to compare it with the standard labor rate for men's coats. So the standard labor rate for men's coats was $13 in this case. So we're going to compare the standard amount with what actually happened. And there was 30 cents more per hour than was before. So this 30 cents would be multiplied by the actual hours for the men's coats. The actual hours for the men's coats is right here, is 2,800 hours. 2,800 actual hours times the variance amount of 30 cents gives you $840. And this $840 is also unfavorable because our actual was more than our budgeted amount. So two unfavorables together make one whole unfavorable amount of $1,022.50, which is your direct labor rate variance. The next one that we're going to work on is our direct labor time variance. And we have to keep up with the direct labor time variance for both the women's coats and the men's coats. We're going to start by taking our actual hours, our direct labor time variance, actual hours that we begin with were given to you. Your actual hours were 1825. We're going to compare it with our standard hours. Now, just like before, we weren't given standard hours. You have to find the standard hours, and I put it in the form of calculations to show you how we would get that. We're going to figure up the standard hours for both the women's and the men's coats and combine them together to get the total for that period of time. So your standard time to produce one unit is 4 parts of an hour. that was given to you. Your standard time is going to be found by taking the time that it takes to produce 1 unit, which for women's coats is 40 parts of an hour, and multiplying that by the actual units that were produced, which was 4,400 for our women's coats. So we're right down here is where we're talking about. You would multiply the actual coats produced that were women's times the standard number of pounds per unit, and that will give you the standard quantity for the women's coats. You do the same thing for the men's coats. You start with the standard number of pounds for the filler. We're only talking about the filler here. And the standard number of pounds for the filler for the men's coats is 5.20 pounds. We're going to multiply that by the actual units produced of men's coats. The actual units produced for the men's coats is 2,800 units. We would, excuse me, the actual units produced, picked up the wrong one. It's right here. It's 5,800. And then 5,800 units produced times the standard number of pounds it takes for one man's coat. You multiply the two of these, and that will give you the standard quantity for your men's coats. Then you simply combine 17,600 plus 30,160, and that'll give you the total amount of the filler. And that's the standard quantity of the filler. And that's the amount that should be used in this calculation. So once you have the standard amount for the filler, we would compare that with the actual amount that we used as far as quantity was concerned. And there's a difference of 240, which is unfavorable. We would multiply this 240 times the standard price of $2, which was given. This is your standard price right there. And so 240 times $2 is 480. And so the filler variance, or the filler quantity variance, is unfavorable. For the liner, we're going to take our actual quantity of the liner that was used, I believe I have skipped around a little bit here. I think I should be down here because we've already talked about how to do this. So I apologize to you, class. There's a lot of calculations on here. So just make sure you understand the calculations. I think they're lined out pretty clearly on the Excel spreadsheet. But we should be looking at the supporting calculations for the quantity of the filler for the men's coats. Shouldn't be up here. So let me go back to the supporting calculations for the filler of the men's coats. We're simply going to take our standard number of pounds per unit, which was 5.2 pounds of filler. And we're going to multiply that by the actual units produced. This 5.2 was given in the information above. The actual units produced was also given in the information above. Just look for it. And then when you multiply the two of these, the standard quantity of the filler that is needed for the men's coats is 30,160 pounds. Then we would add that to the women's standard quantity. These two combined together will give you the total standard quantity of the filler, which we are going to place in this direct materials quantity variance. The supporting calculations for the liner is also the standard number of units is given in the information above. You're just going to find the given information and multiply it to find the standard quantity for the women's coats, and you'll do the same thing for the men's coats. This information is given, and then add the two together. Your total liner for this company is 85,320 yards. And that would be substituted in to your quantity variance for your liner. The actual quantity was given above. This you had to find, and the difference between these two is favorable. And then you multiply that by the standard price, which is given, and then the whole variance will be favorable. Combine the favorable variance with the unfavorable variance to get a favorable 1,280 variance for your direct materials quantity variance. Then what we're going to do is we're going to combine the variances together to get the total materials cost variance. And right here, class, this is just another way of calculating the same thing up above. I think I've really repeated myself a lot in this particular problem. I hope you've been able to follow along with me. But basically this is the same. Look at the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet is correct, and you can see what you're doing step by step here. The main thing is that you learn the variances and how to calculate the variances, the formulas behind them, and learn how to calculate your standard hours and your standard quantity. But all this information is in this Excel spreadsheet. And again, I apologize to you. Feel like I've gotten you into it, and then I might have gotten lost a little bit along the way myself, so I'll try to pay more attention to what I'm doing here. The actual, to find the direct labor rate variance, which is the second part of the first problem, you're going to look for your actual direct labor rate, which is given. The standard is also given. Compare the two to get this, and then multiply it by the actual hours, which was given. All of this information basically is given, and so you just had to find the direct labor rate variance for the women's coats. You're going to do the same thing for the men's coats. This is given. So I feel like you can do that. Then combine the two together, and that gives you the unfavorable direct labor rate variance. And I believe where I got messed up was we were actually down here talking about the time variance. And the time variance, this is your formula for it. Your actual hours are given in the information above. The standard hours you have to calculate. And this is how you calculate the standard hours For the women's coats, that's what we're going to start with first. You take the standard time to produce 1 unit, that's given. And then you multiply it by your actual units produced, that's given too. So 4,400 times 40% of an hour will give you 1,760 hours, direct labor hours, that it took in standard hours to produce the women's coats. So this amount right here is substituted up here. Then you compare your actual to your standard, get your variance, and then multiply it by the standard direct labor rate, and that's your time variance. So you have to do the same thing for the men's coats. You have to find your standard hours. See, the standard hours are in the supporting calculations below. The standard time to produce one man's coat is half an hour. And we're going to multiply that by the actual units produced. And that gives us the standard hours. The standard hours are 2,900 hours that we're going to substitute in here, and then we're going to compare it to the actual hours for men's coats. Our actual was less than our standard, so we had a favorable men's coats variance for our time variance. And then we will multiply that by the direct labor, standard direct labor rate, which is given, and that will give you this $1,300 total direct labor variance for the men's coats. You have to combine your women's coats and your men's coats together to get the total favorable variance. That's your time variance here. Notice it popped up in red in this situation here, but this is favorable and it's negative. Notice it's got parentheses around it. When you're in Cengage, make sure you enter this as a negative amount or it'll count it wrong. Then you combine the two of these together, your total direct labor variance is $632.50. And because we had more unfavorable than favorable, our variance is unfavorable here. And so then they had one more part that they wanted you to analyze, and it was basically just fill in the blank. And it talks about the various analysis here. So what I want you to learn how to do, class, is you need to know how to calculate the price variance, the direct materials quantity variance, and the total materials variance. You also need to know how to calculate the direct labor rate variance, the direct labor time variance, and the total direct labor variance. These formulas are very important for you to learn. So learn these formulas. I got it lined out for you step by step. And this is pretty simple and straightforward, except for in this problem, we had two different products and two different materials that we were working on. But once you get your information organized, it becomes simpler for you to understand. And so another thing that I want you to realize is that these variances mean something. So for example, in the direct materials price variance for our filler, the total direct materials price variance for both of our materials was unfavorable. As management, you would want to look at why that came up unfavorable. And as you can see here, when we broke it down separately, our filler didn't cost us as much as what we thought, and that's why it was favorable. but our liner cost us more than what we thought. So we'd want to go back to the purchasing department to see why these differences happened. And if there's something that we could correct as management, we would do that in the future. So these variance analysis are to help you to analyze what went on in your company and to give you a way for you to be able to direct your employees in the future so that you will have better operations. The quantity variance, you would probably need to go back to your production department for that because they would be responsible for using the materials. And so in this, for the filler, we use more materials than what we expected. And we want to know why that happened. Perhaps we had a employee that was inexperienced, and so they had to use more filler in their coats than they thought. Or maybe there was just a miscalculation. Whatever, you need to figure out what the difference is so that it will help you to direct your operations in the future. So with the price variance, we would go to the purchasing department. With the quantity variances, we go back to our production department to see what was going on. With our time variances, we would go back to the production department and analyze those. So you can see with your rate variance that we started with, both of these were unfavorable. So we'd want to know why these were unfavorable rates. Perhaps we gave an employee a raise. It could be something as simple as that. But management would want to look into these things to see why they happened. And the time variance, so you could probably go to HR for this, but the time variance, the actual time that was spent, would go back to the production department to look and see what happened there. Notice this one's favorable, so perhaps we had an employee that was highly trained and knew better what they were doing, and so they did better with their time variance here. But in this case, they were worse, but yet they paid them more. So I don't know. But anyway, management would have to just go back and look at these items. That's what they're there for. So that's all I want to talk to you about today. And I hope I haven't confused you to death. Just look at this spreadsheet that I've given to you. It will show you step by step what to do. So we'll stop sharing and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.